So thank you all for coming out tonight. It's quite a good turnout, and I'd like to recognize that we are on the unceded territories of the Sinixt Nation. And so we work at protecting land, and we're protecting this land for all peoples. Way back in the 1970s, when we first worked on the Valhalla proposal, we recognized the need for whole landscapes. Back in that day, this was the first proposal that took in the full landscape from low elevation lake to mountaintop. Prior to that, the government was happy to give us mountaintop parks or alpine parks and leave the forested slopes for the loggers. But we understood then you needed a full landscape if we were going to maintain the biodiversity, the rich biodiversity that many of us in BC grew up with. Tonight's presentation will be in two parts. I'll first give an overview of the Selkirk Mountain Caribou Park proposal, of which the Nkomaplu River Valley is the jewel of the proposal. And the second part will be an introduction by Amber and of a film by Damien Gillis called Primeval Enter the Nkomaplu. Our campaign to protect the Nkomaplu first started about 20 years ago as a project to identify the remnant old-growth forests left in the interior of BC. Many of us that grew up here saw how rapidly we were destroying these forests without even knowing what was in them. So Valhalla started a project called the Inland Temperate Rainforest Project, and it coincided with what was known as the interior wet belt of BC. It covers about 14.3 million hectares, and we employed GIS experts and conservation biologists to try identify where the richest or the most rainforestness, our wettest forests remaining and our biggest, oldest trees. As they identified these trees, we did field trips, and of course we went out and found that the loggers had beat us to many of these places. This is the Adams River Valley, one of the world's best sockeye spawning habitats. And this is all we left for protection of the Adams River, a narrow strip of forest. Many of these forests in the interior rainforest are also mountain caribou habitat. And it's because of logging like this that biologists can say, well, caribou only use the high country. Well, that's because we drove them out of the low country. Everywhere you go in prime valley bottoms, it's nothing but a carpet of clear cuts. And in all our travels, what we were finding is that the forests of the Nkomaplu stood out as being very unique. And around this, we also found other wet forests in the Westfall, in the Upper Duncan, Healy Creek. And so we drew up this proposal. It looks like a jigsaw puzzle because we're concentrating on valley bottom old growth, and we're also trying to reintroduce connectivity back into our landscape. So we're trying to link some of our parks together so that we have some kind of flow for our larger wildlife species and even our smaller wildlife species. Despite focusing on valley bottom old growth, only 11% of our proposal is in timber harvesting land base. The remainder is in higher elevations up above the timber harvesting land base. The purple slashing in this is the ungulate winter range set aside by caribou, or by the mountain caribou recovery plan. This happened in 2008, and at the time the forest industry was crying that it was losing timber, but you can see from this, all the red is the timber harvesting land base, very narrow slivers. The majority of the caribou ungulate winter range was above the timber harvesting land base and virtually had no effect on the timber industry. Need to get my pointer going again. And yes.
So you have to point it over here?
Mm-hmm. No, I got a
the laser
here, but I think the battery's gone down. So anyway, recently, the forests along the west side of Duncan Lake were some of the longest, most intact forests, low elevation forests south of Prince George and outside of parks that were caribou habitat. But in the last several years, BC Timber Sales is actively building logging road, and they're now halfway down the lake and have a whole mass of clear cuts planned. And this is what's happening with our mountain caribou. As we're losing our mountain caribou, the government still has people sitting at the tables talking about how we're going to protect caribou while they continue to log their habitat. We call this process talk and log. It gets us nowhere. We lose the caribou and the timber industry continue logging as they always have. The forests of the Upper Duncan, the head of Duncan Lake, we thought were somewhat secure. Although in our proposal, they were also in what we thought were old growth management areas. But when we went in to investigate, not very far from this 3.5 meter cedar, we found shake bolt cutting and everything else. But these forests are very important. Their large structure is important denning habitat for black bears. Their modified climate give good refuge and growth areas for fungi, which are important for feeding many ungulates. And they also host many lichen species. In forests similar to this in the Nkalmaplu, we have found 3 lichen species new to BC, another 3 new to North America, and 12 of them are new to science. So, and one of them still is exclusive only to the Nkalmaplu. And this is because of the immense old age of these forests and the modified climate that they have under them. So even in the very hottest days of this summer, it is still moist and humid under this canopy. But the Ministry of Forests is hell-bent on destroying this habitat. For a $50 permit, they allowed 7 shake bolting sites like this throughout the forest. And you can't even clean up one of these sites for the $50 that the ministry got. And they allow these sites without knowing what species are there. This is a very uncommon moss called Schistostica pinnata, or goblin's gold. It typically is found in root wads, tip-up areas where it's very moist, and mainly in old-growth forests, but they have been found in stream bottoms of younger forests. But this particular colony could have been destroyed. They shake bolted within 5 feet of it on the other end of the log, cutting the log without even knowing that the species was there. And this was a black bear den within 100 meters of that shake bolting site. So they go in, there's product there, go get it. They don't care. They still, after 50 years of us protesting, many of you I've seen on various protest lines throughout the years, and despite all this, we're still going in and allowing that kind of logging to happen without paying attention to what is there first, what do we have to maintain on the land before we take product or make money off of it. Shortly after we released our park proposal, BC's Auditor General released his report on his audit of the BC park system. And he found that overall throughout BC, the majority of our parks were too small to maintain large species of wildlife. That there was no connectivity plan to link these parks together. And he stated that without connectivity, we will not be able to maintain the biodiversity that we have today. The Nkamaplu is the jewel and the crown of our park proposal, but the remainder of the crown is pretty spectacular also. This is the Razor's Edge in Mount Templeman at the headwaters of Healy Creek. This was prime caribou habitat. We've seen caribou or their tracks in there every time we went in, but in the current ministry policy of let it burn, prime caribou habitat in this valley has been allowed to be burned up. We're looking up the East Creek drainage, a worthy old growth valley connector to the Bugaboo Park. Both East Creek and its sister creek to the north, Giedrich, are both unroaded valleys to this day. The terrain in them is severe enough that road building is too expensive, so they remain outside the timber harvesting land base and are somewhat protected because of that. But again, should economics change, they aren't fully protected, so they're part of our park proposal. This is looking into the upper Westfall. The Westfall River has had significant logging in it, but there's still large enough patches of old growth left to make it a worthy addition to the park proposal. It could be good recovery habitat for mountain caribou, as well as hosting vast herds of elk and moose. We're in the upper Duncan, and we're looking across the Duncan into Butters Creek. The flat top peak in the center of the picture is the southern boundary of Glacier Park. So Glacier Park flows on all those mountain ridges to the north, and our park proposal flows to the south and takes in the valley bottoms. All these mountains and glaciers in our park proposal produce a plenitude of cold, well-aerated flowing water. This is necessary to support the fisheries in the Arrow and the Kootenay Lakes. Here's a bull trout trying to negotiate this cascade. Once above this cascade, the bull trout have the remaining 25 kilometers of river all to themselves, because no other fish species can negotiate that cascade. So they come up into the smaller stream beds and look for these kind of fist-sized boulders, and this is where you see them make their spawning reds and lay their eggs for the next generation of fish. At one time, Chinook salmon used to make it up the Nkamaplu. This is a day's catch by a fisherman. Looks like he was using a shotgun. This is at a historic town not too far from the mouth of the Nkamaplu called Kamapli. So this would have been around 1900, and before all the dams on the Columbia, we had Chinook salmon that used to come up there. The clear, cold waters before spring freshet are very important for the spawning of the Girard rainbow, only found in the West Kootenay region. And most of the creeks and rivers support spawning kokanee. And every fall, our creeks and rivers would be loaded with these landlocked salmon that were coming upstream to spawn. These form important late season food sources for grizzly bear before they went into hibernation. These food cycles have gone on for thousands of years. And the habitat that has allowed that to happen must be protected. And we hope to protect that habitat in our Selkirk Mountain Caribou Park proposal. Not only does this proposal contain habitat for grizzly bears, it also supports moose, elk, and deer, and it once had numerous herds of mountain caribou. This is now one of the 30 remaining mountain caribou in the central Selkirk herd. This picture was taken last October about this time in the Largo River, while the Fish and Wildlife are trying to tell us, oh no, the caribou are just on the mountaintops. We're watching them with radio collars. Well, you don't see a radio collar on this fella, and we were able to show on several instances that the caribou are still, despite our heavy habitat destruction, are still using valley bottom forest if there's suitable habitat there. Our mountain caribou are very unique. They're the only ungulate that migrates to high country in winter. All other ungulates, moose, elk, deer, all head to the bottomlands come winter. But caribou, when the snowpack gets deep enough, usually meter and a half of snow, enough of a platform that they can be on top of that with their big feet, because they feed on hair lichens growing in the spruce and balsam. So usually about mid-January they'll head to the high country and stay there until April, until the snowpack starts getting too rotten to support their weight, and then they move down to the valley bottoms. So mountain caribou are different than all the other caribou. So once we lose these caribou, they're gone forever. We can't bring in other caribou and hope that they're going to learn this habitat in the deep snow of heading to the high country. They tried that in the Purcells about 4 or 5 years ago. They brought 20 caribou down and lost 19 of them within the first year, because they couldn't get those caribou mated up with the existing herd. They turned them loose, and of course the transplanted caribou headed to the valley bottoms, and that's where the cougar were, and the cougar just picked them off. This is what prime caribou habitat looks like. This is what 50 years of our industrial logging has done. This was once all old growth forest and prime old growth forest. This is Downey Creek, 50 kilometers north of Revelstoke. We have converted these old growth forests to early seral and plantation forest. Of course, early seral is brush species, and that attracts your moose, elk, and deer. And that's what brings in your predators. The moose is, its primary predator is wolves. So wolves will be wherever the moose are. And if caribou are in these small fragments, old growth cut blocks, they're an easy take for wolves. But the caribou are just a bycatch of wolves. And that's why the government's wolf killing program is so misguided. They're dealing with the true effect or true cause of the demise of caribou, or butchering of their low elevation habitat. Instead, it's cheaper for them to hire some sharpshooters and throw them in a helicopter to go out and shoot wolves. That way they can tell the population, oh yeah, we're spending a couple $1 million a year and we're still losing caribou. It's my opinion that they're deliberately doing this, because once the caribou are gone off the landscape, then they can continue with their logging as usual. A wolf is capable, it can trot at 10K an hour all day long. So when you look at this network of clear cuts, they're all linked together with roads. We've made a prime hunting network for these wolves. They can cover that landscape in a day. When they got a scent, they signal to the rest of their pack and they zero in where they can do some hunting. Not only that, in the winter and our, again, for motorized recreation, we're going into prime caribou habitat. This basin used to have caribou in it, but this is what a weekend of sledding looks like. And on this, within 2 hours, an adult can walk on those tracks without any aids such as snowshoes or skis. Those tracks freeze in. They'll stay in the snowpack up to 2 to 3 weeks depending on weather conditions. So they make prime predator access to winter mountain caribou habitat. And on top of it, the government allows the sledders to use grooming machines, because the modern sleds and all their power after a weekend of sledding on a road is a washboard that you can hardly ride on. But with the groomers, they keep that trail packed flat, so these sleds can get 20 kilometers into the backcountry in an hour on these packed trails. So that gives them more time to run around and pack out caribou habitat in the high country. So instead of hiring sharpshooters, shouldn't we be getting these packers? Cost the government nothing to say, you can't pack the trails anymore. Okay, these are key habitat areas. No more sledding in. But instead, no, it's let's shoot wolves and keep playing in the caribou habitat. That shows you how fast a wolf can move on the sled track. So there's some sad numbers of where our mountain caribou are at. I used 2008 as a starting point. It'd be even more dramatic if I went back to 1995, like the Central Selkirks in 1995 had 235 caribou. But why we use 2008 is 2008 was the first full year that the Mountain Caribou Recovery Implementation Plan was implemented in full force. And the first key or first goal of the implementation plan was to halt the decline of all herds of caribou in 10 years. Well, there's 10 years of caribou statistics. And you can see what a failure the Mountain Caribou Recovery Plan has been. There's only one herd perhaps that may be increasing. The Nkamaplu was once a majestic forest of old-growth cedar, but 35 kilometers of that valley has been clear-cut and is now either brush or plantation forests. The Nkamaplu, despite its rich biodiversity, was designated by government as a low biodiversity zone. That meant the largest clear cuts, the most waste, and the smallest leaf blocks. When you leave tons of waste on the ground, it means hot slash burns. And much of our forests depend on the mycelia and mycorrhiza that grow under the ground that we don't see. But when you do hot slash burns like that, everything gets destroyed and set back to zero. Once these forests are cut down, no generation of us will ever see a forest of that stature on those lands again. Many of these trees are 1,000 to 1,500 years old. And in the government's plan of 100-year rotations, we will never see trees getting a chance to grow that size. So that's why it's so important now. What we've identified are just remnant stands of what once was of big old growth trees. And once we lose them, they're gone forever. No generation will ever see them again. These forests and the species they contain are part of the natural heritage of all Canadians. We urge you to join with us tonight and write letters of support, contact your MLA, contact the ministers, there's fact sheets there. Do whatever you can to put pressure on the politicians and let them know that you want an end to old growth cutting, you want caribou on our landscape. After all, we've had them on our 25-cent piece for the last 50 years. And we want this area, the Selkirk Mountain Caribou Park, protected fully. Thank you.